Our speaker is Dr. Hagai Boas. Dr. Boas holds a PhD in sociology from this university. His field of expertise is the sociology of health and bioethics, and he has written mainly on the political economy of organ transplantations. Specifically, he is interested in the embeddedness of medical technologies in social settings and the interplay between morals, politics, and technology. Dr. Boas is also the program director of the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics, and he has done a lot to organize this conference. The commentator, Professor Galili Shahar, to my left, he's a professor of comparative literature of German studies, and he's here at Tel Aviv University, and he serves as the director of the Minerva Institute for German History at the university.
Thank you. This is actually a work in progress, and many ideas that somehow turn to be glued together, and I hope it will make some sense. So, in his most celebrated fable, The Happy Prince, Oscar Wilde introduced a particular version of sacrifice. The act of sacrifice is taking place outside the human world. In a universe composed of birds and statues, compassion, self-sacrifice, and altruism do exist. The Happy Prince, which is, and I quote, is gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold, 2 bright sapphires for eyes, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword hilt, but with a heart made of lead, end of quote, sends the swallow to dismantle his body, piece by piece, both his eyes, his skin of gilded leaves, and to deliver his precious body parts to the poor and the miserable. After sacrificing his valuable body parts, realizing that he is also sacrificing the future life of the swallow in the warm climate of Egypt, the leaden heart of the prince snaps into 2, resembling the ultimate sacrifice. As he is no longer beautiful, he is no longer useful, says the art professor at the university. In The Happy Prince, as well as in his other fables such as The Selfish Giant, Wilde criticizes the utilitarian atomistic society in which the concern for the other is expunged by self-interest and egocentrism. In such a world, where social relations are totally secularized, stripped out to their naked self-interest exchange, it seems as there is no room for heroism, irrational altruism, and emotion. What then are the signs of self-sacrifice in our modern individualistic society? Does self-sacrifice still bear the forms of the sacred? Etymologically, sacrifice means a sacred deed. Does any aspect of the sacred still remain in the practice of modern self-sacrifice? Can we identify the Via Dolorosa, the Passion, the passion, the visual pain of the martyr, of the tortured body in our modern time? In this talk, I wish to discuss a specific form of self-sacrifice which is present in our technological world of modern medicine, a donation of a kidney from a living person to a stranger. This form of donation varies from other versions of organ transfers. In contrast to the common direct living organ donation, this donation is not about saving one's own relative. It is not offering your kidney to a needed friend or even to an acquaintance. It is a donation of a kidney to a complete stranger. In living donations, the sacrifice, obviously, is not total as in deceased donations. The donor will bear the signs of the sacrifice throughout his or her life. The donor's body, the now one kidney body, a deficient body, becomes then a testimony of the sacrifice, of the voluntarily sacrifice. In order to deeply understand the meaning of this form of self-sacrifice, the third one, which is different from the family and the state, and I'll return to that later. In order to deeply understand this meaning, I wish to delve into the anthropology of the sacrificed body. Galili Shahar, here to my left, and my commentator, argues that the sacred body is the body which transcends corporeality. The sacred body is the body which transforms into sacredness out of pain, misery, and suffering. The sacrificed body presents us with the internal contradiction. It is both a public manifestation of unbearable pain at the same time as the defeat of the aching flesh by transcending into holiness. Sacredness thus emerges from the soaring flesh, from the wounded body. This is the dialectic of sacrifice. The injured body, the deficient body, finds its completion in the blessing. The completion of the injured body as a sign of the blessing could be seen as the theological framing of the sacrificed body in Western culture. This is the story of the crucified, as well as the story of Prometheus, which liver is eaten again and again by vulture. This wound becomes the symbol for the blessed. Therefore, pain in its pre-medicalized period was conceived perhaps as a gateway to sacredness, as the mark of the holy. The resemblance between organ donation and Judeo-Christian roots of self-sacrifice is supposed to, presumably, mitigate the acceptance of transplant medicine in Western society. Indeed, in Catholic societies such as Spain and Ireland, the rates of deceased organ donations are among the highest in the world. The papal approval of the practice already in its inceptive years has certainly eased Christians to hold organ donor cards. "Don't take your organs to heaven, heaven knows we need them here," is a slogan emphasizing the religion appeal of organ donation and underscores the importance of religion as a mediating agency between transplant medicine and society. Israel, in this respect, makes an interesting case. Although it has high-level transplant medicine, full insurance covering for post-operative organ recipients and advanced transplant centers, it lags far behind developed society in its organ donation rates. The reasons are often ascribed to the opposition of ultra-Orthodox circles to the definition of brain death, a precondition for deceased organ donations. Religion, therefore, has been understood as an inhibitor rather than a facilitator of organ donations in Israel. And here you see the focus of the state agency and others on religion. These are both signing for organ donor cards, which has a religious emphasis on it. The poor rates of deceased organ donations in Israel led to alternative channels of organ supply for kidney patients. Living donations are a possible way out of the lengthening waiting list. Anonymous living donors compose such an alternative channel of organ supply. In Israel, this version of organ transfer is orchestrated by Gift of Life, Matnat Chaim organization that has dramatically turned the tide here in the supply of organ donation. My talk is about this organization. Matnat Chaim was founded in 2009 as a charity fund by Rabbi Yeshayahu Heber, a kidney recipient himself, who is both the organization's chairperson and administrator. On its website, the fund takes pride of its hundreds of successful matches between donors and recipients. Indeed, the life project of Heber is remarkable in its actual achievements. It has already matched more than 300 pairs of unrelated donors and recipients as of May 2016. The Jewish religious character of the fund is eye-catching. It is often referred to as the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox fund of kidney donations. The reaching out operations of the organizations are often conducted in synagogues, through local papers read by Orthodox population, and in rather closed religious communities. A quick skimming over the fund's publication reveals a prominent use of religious discourse, and its website is replete with events from Jewish day-to-day religious life. Here are some sociological figures. This is the number of donations that the organization has procured during the recent years. This is up to April 2016. And here we see the gender distribution, which is interesting because in living donation, we are often meet with an opposite gender gap in which women donate more than men. And in this organization, we see that there is a reverse. We can refer to that later in the discussion. But what interests me mostly is the religious aspect of this organization. And the centrality of religion in this context is striking, whereas high levels of religiosity among Israeli Jews were considered as a barrier to organ donations due to the debate over the definition of brain death, Matnat Chaim presents us with a reverse correlation. High level of religiosity become, apparently, facilitator rather than inhibitor to organ donations. So far, there was not one non-Jew among the donor procured by the organization and only one non-Jew recipient. It should be noted that Matnat Chaim has no stated clear discriminatory policy, and at the formal level it is open to all sectors of Israeli society. Yet, its salient religious feature implies the homogeneity of its inscribed population of both donors and recipients. The distinct character of closed and consolidated community is perhaps the organization's key of turning religious identity to a driving force of organ donation. I wish to dedicate the last minutes of my talk to understanding this. In February 2016, the organization has gathered 120 donors to spend a weekend together. Reviewing this event, journalist Stern reports, and I quote, "The participants are all alike, and this homogeneity immediately catches the eye. Black and knitted kippas, scarves, toupee, and head covering for women, and only a handful of secular." Ruti, a donor, tells the reporter how proud she is in saving the life of a Jewish boy. I quote, "The emphasis on the recipient's religion is not accidental," writes the reporter. Time and again, donors repeat how they insisted on donating only to Jews. And here is the quotation. "It is about people with values," says Ashira Ben Shahar, a 39-year-old nurse whose husband donated a kidney a year ago. The couple lives in Pnei Kedem settlement. "It is at the end of the world," she laughs. "Compared to us, you are living in a busy city," comments her table partner Moshe Tzuriel from Peduel settlement, who donated his kidney a few months ago to a woman with a mental disability. "I, as all the donors from Peduel, have reached Matnat Chaim through Gabi Revivu that has spread the word, and 6 persons from our settlement become donors." Gabi joins the table, hugs Moshe, and laughs. "We are in competition with Hitzar, another settlement. We lead for now 6-5. "And was it important to you donating to a specific sector?" Moshe, "I did not limit the donation, but it was important to me that the recipient will be Jewish." Ruti, "The issue of donating to Jews is pretty common. It is a request which I know is acceptable among donors. Some wish to donate to a child, some to a woman, some to young, and some wish benefiting the old." "If saving life, why this condition? Isn't that a bit racist?" Menachem, "I am first of all concerned with the troubles of my own people. Charity begins at home. If I am making this big step and giving something out of me, I wish to give it to someone for my own people. This is natural, and this is also my right." The donors' religiosity serves as their common habitus. They act, behave, and speak the social language of contemporary Orthodox Israeli Judaism. This is the framing of their social life. Nonetheless, I suggest reading the Matnat Chaim phenomenon as reflecting a constellation of religious framing and individualistic agency. Community and agency in living unrelated organ donation in Israel, and here I wish to offer a sociological account of how religion plays a role in the procurement of organ donors. Sociologist Pitirim Sorokin has coined the term creative altruism, arguing that altruistic behavior generates more circle of altruistic behavior, and this enhances social solidarity. The competition between the two small settlements, two small communities, exemplifies how altruism begets wider circle of altruistic behavior and an in-group sense of social solidarity. Many donors admit to learn on the possibility to donate a kidney to a stranger from a first-hand experience, a relative, a friend, or even a moving story in the newspaper. Once entered the Donors Club, they are becoming enthusiastic of telling publicly their own story, expanding even further the impact of creative altruism. So far, the impact of creative altruism has not breached through the sociological segregation walls of Israeli society. Not only that all donors come from the majority Jewish population, but also within this population they seem as a very sectorial group. But it is specifically in the context of small group networking that I suggest understanding the impact of creative altruism. It seems as if the donation creates an ideal conduct, a challenge to be followed by others who conceive themselves as idealistic persons, as committed to what they see as a high level of behavior and conduct. I quote, "We are all people with values." In small homogenic societies, Gemeinschaft, as sociologists termed it, the effect of challenging the community's member with a higher ideal of conduct is bigger than in more heterogenic social context. Against this background, it is no wonder that the ideal of donating a kidney to a stranger is spread by social media, which are communal and sectorial. This ideal conduct is then embedded into the communal order of deeds and charities as an example of elite morality. It is no less than the ultimate charity, a challenge for the faith holder. Limiting the donation to Jewish patients alone is perhaps another indicator of the in-group sense of closed, homogenic community. The charity begins at home, home being a Jewish home, can only be exercised from the institutional standing status of Matnat Chaim as a third sector fund from the donor standing as private initiators of organ donations. Combined with the political reality of social life in Israel, charity begins at home is another screen of excluding practices. As a private initiative, the fund and the donor are not obliged to the norms and the values of democratic society. They have the privilege not to follow equity in the selection of potential donors. If we understand the political economy of organ supply as the interplay between state, the family, and the market, then Matnat Chaim stands in between these social institutions. In matching strangers as donor and recipient, it exhibits traits that pertain to the state that orchestrates such altruistic transfers in deceased organ donations. In its status as private organization, which is not obliged to the universal code of citizenship and acts according to a different register of preferences, the organization resembles a market agent, or at least a non-profit organization. But above all, Matnat Chaim is closer to the family in its donation practices. It is not only that the family becomes a prominent discursive idiom for the community of donors and recipients, but also in its in-group conception, as a unit with clear boundaries. In this sense, charity begins at home can be read as the particular giving that characterizes intrafamilial donation. As the parent donates to her own specific child and not to another child, and places the health of her own child at the top of her interest, so thus the Jewish donor conditions his donation within what he understands as his extended family of the Jewish people. The normative expectation of commitment and sacrifice within the family unit is translated to the extended family. The family, the pre-modern institution of the household, precedes the state. In-group belonging overpowers notions of citizenship. I wish to suggest another layer of explanation to the insistence of donors to limit themselves only to Jewish population. In addition to the in-group belonging, the community as extended family, I see their request as resulting from what could be termed as excessive agency. In deceased donations, agency is limited to expressing your consent to become an organ donor. It is impossible to set conditions or to direct your donation to a specific group of people or to a particular individual. In living donations, however, donors enjoy a larger set of possibilities to exercise their agency. Reading stories of living donors display self-account of doing, of active roles, of initiatives, of making choices, of taking decisions. Altruism indeed obliges an active role. Nonetheless, the active role of the living anonymous donor has no limits. It is not restricted by formal ethics. It is not restricted by formal ethical regulations other than communal norms. As the act of cutting one of your kidneys and giving it to a stranger is indeed an extreme act, the transgression is translated into the ethical field. The saving of life empowers self-esteem of the donor, emphasizes even further his potent agency. As cited above, the donor chooses whether they prefer a young or an old recipient, men or women, and above all, they prefer to donate to Jews. As free agents experimenting with the challenge of donating a kidney, these donors are often project their world of values into their act of donation. This is where I see their agency as excessive. It has no ethics rather than the ethics of self-doing. It seems as if being qualified as altruistic, that is, not driven to donation by materialistic considerations, grants a license to act as an elite which is obliged to no ethics rather than one's self-code of moral preferences. Ironically, this excessive agency of self-doing, which can be read as egocentric maybe, becomes other-oriented and altruistic towards stranger and is saving life. Conclusion. Where the story of Matnat Chaim fits in this chain of bodily sacrifices? Does it display a revival of the sacred, now an altruistic donor? The sacrificing body, as argued in the beginning of this talk, indicates the transcending into holiness. Kidney donation imitates such bodily sacrifices and thus serves as a direct continuation of the theological roots of bodily sacrifices. Nonetheless, living organ donation is ingrained in the contemporary reality of modern society. It is not only about the modern uses of advanced medical technologies, but also the framing of the anonymous living donations in a modern sociological setting of individual agency and community. Limiting the donation to Jews does dissonance with universal understanding of altruism, but it is this limitation that provides another evidence of the more secularized perception of the act, not as directed above as a token of faith, but rather as rooted in the messy reality of here and now social relations. In this sense, it is about value choices. That is, it is about generating new bioethics of organ donations. It provides an alternative to the liberal bioethics that does not necessarily go back to theology.
Thank you, Hagai. Professor Shahar.
Thank you, Yaacov. Right. It is with much interest that I read and now hear the rich paper submitted by Dr. Hagai Boas dealing with the modern theology of sacrificing and the case of organ donations. Now, I'm not to offer a review of his rich essay, but rather a few remarks on the theoretical frameworks of his talk and its methodological implications, or a few of them. The major argument made in the first part of his paper is that living organ donations can be understood as a new mode of self-sacrificing which we normally associated with the sacred order and with theological conceptions of being, such as the martyr, the holy wound, the redeemer. In modern Western culture and society, this mode of self-sacrificing is being transformed, adapted, internalized, rationalized, materialized into the secular order. This all depends if one accepts the existence of secular order as such, and if yes, what kind of secular order is being accepted. But we are not to discuss this question now. But rather, we should agree that sacrificing, which once and still is identified with the sacred order, the order of the divine, is being aufgehoben, right, and transformed into higher modern organizations and agencies of life and death, so of decision on life and death, in which sacrificing is being replaced with different sets of concepts or of values which are not necessarily occupied or recalled by God's name. This is, in my view, a good reason to deal with the theological remnants and the leftovers of martyrs and sacred bodies in the modern era, in our own time, for what we often understand as secular or liberal being identified with effective functioning social order based on scientific hermeneutics of the body and with rational individual thinking and acting, still bears, as we know, its own mythical power, its own destructive means of violence, its own wound, and what we would wish to think as secular or even as liberal is often another form of a miserable religion. However, the argument made here by Hagai is more concrete. He asks about the possibilities of thinking the case of organ donations as sacrificing, which is not only based on the Judaic-Christian traditions of martyrs, but rather on its transformation into a modern progressive social order that is rather based on ethical decisions of individuals. And again, we have suspended the critical discussion regarding the possibilities of the modern social as such, namely the secular to be, without assuming the existence of certain theological preconditions, partially being distorted, however, still ones that secular itself depends on. So it's like an interruption, ongoing, right? It's very difficult to speak of the secular without those collapses into the theological precondition, even it is, right, distorted or unseen or forgotten. Yet, this is the argument Hagai is making. We can and should imagine the possibilities of justifying organ donation as an ethical act, a performance of altruism, which not only seems to contradict the assumptions regarding the ideals and values of modern being. This is more into your first part. It seems impossible now in that age, right, to donate, right, to the stranger circle. However, so an age in which we are turning more and more selfish, right? For this is the era of the ego, in which we live, governed by the self-images and the neglect or the forgetfulness of the other as such, which is not identified with the self, right? The other as such, which is the unfamiliar and not another self. There are alternatives for the social and political government of the self, alternatives which partially are associated with the religious. This is perhaps the tone I heard in Hagai's paper. For theological institutions or religious traditions, Hagai shows, can actually play a progressive role in justifying organ donation using some kind of utilitarian argument suggesting an ethical dimension to the medical discourse and the social conception of donation as the gift of life. It seems thus that in the case of organ donation, the relics of Christian and Jewish traditions, not to speak of the Muslim, right? There's another complications there. The leftovers of the sacred order are in play and are partially transformed to contemporary progressive discourse on altruism and even become an avant-garde of certain medical ethics and social practices regarding living donation. This is the case of Spain, Italy, and right, in certain areas in Israel. Nations, however, and this should be an argument, are not merely acts of martyrs. The giving up of a body organ for the life of the other and even risking your own life for a stranger is not an ideal, pure act of self-sacrificing as long as this is not performed by the name of God. This is an argument to make, namely associated with the sacred order. What is left is the mythical remnant of the theological order which offers itself anew, and this is different. This is different. We are dealing with mythical remnants of the theological order. That is to say, with the political power which is left. However, this could be a lesson, and I think a good lesson, on the dialectic of the secular and the vicinity of the liberal social order, which everywhere today is in a great need for foundational legitimization and therefore base itself today on reinterpretations or reperformances of theological traditions. So we need the religious in order, right, to justify what the secular cannot make because it collapses in the self, right? This is the argument, again, the tone I heard. This is also the case in the state of Israel. So now the remarks on the last part of your article, as we are familiar with. As the discourses of civil society, law institutions, and the public sphere collapse, those empty spaces, no man's land of the state are being filled with agencies of all kinds. Right, it's Afrata Gdola, right, of the public sphere. The inabilities of the state and of the civil spheres, which is even worse, lead often to alternatives such as Matnat Chaim, the gift of life, an ultra-Orthodox organization, Hagai, shows that plays a crucial leading role in turning the organ donation in Israel from almost being a taboo into what they call an excessive agency, so too much of a discourse and of justification, which redefines the terms of donation in voluntary terms, preferring, however, a donation traffic that is from Jews to Jews, creating a kind of frame of community, a kind of extended family that is a small nation, eine Gemeinschaft, I would prefer eine kleine Nation, right? Eine Städtel, which, however, which is a settlement, right? Which, however, is not based on civil agreements and solidarities, but rather on kinships which are mimetic to the relations of blood. So we are already and always on the mimetic stages, right? Faith or race. This is what we call, or I call the beginning, a miserable religion. For it's based on a false interpretations of tradition and the turning of the real subject, the other, the stranger, the unfamiliar, into a collective selfness. So there's a wrong way of stabilizing tradition as such. And again, it is because of the vicinity of the secular order itself that we recreate what tradition is. It might be, as Hagai argues very well, that agencies as such, religious of their kind, what I argue to be false in terms of not offering a radical interpretations to the open dimension of Jewish tradition, but rather in stressing its exclusive layers. So we are like in a debate on what is tradition, where I suggest to offer a more nihilistic view on the open dimension of it, and to argue more against, right, the idea of its stable or valuable dimensions. However, we are in agreement that it contributes to the public's policies and practices of organ donations, a policy, a practice that might end with saving life. It's a strong argument in your paper. Now, this, however, should call us into a different path of thinking, recalling the question, the forgotten one, namely, what is life that merits? So life that is free from those false abstractions and interpretations. So the argument, it saves life, it's not the end of the game, but rather its beginning. It recalls, right, a discussion on the loss of being. It calls us indeed, and here I'm in agreement with Hagai, to return to the realm of tradition, free, however, from false values and determinations regarding the human conditions or the exclusive kinship, but rather as a playful bodies, dialectic enough, so secular and sacred at the same time, right? for engaging the concreteness of the unfamiliar, that is a neighbor, a God or a man living among us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shahar. Comments, please.
Two points, questions.
Yes. Oh, you need to.
One, which is up in a constant campaign. It's central to the construction of organ donation from the live, that it's innocuous, painless, it's a mere discomfort. So part of the rhetoric justifying what's behind it, it's not a big issue. So it's the sacrifice, non-sacrifice, and it's not something everybody's running to do, but it's not clear at all what the sacrifice is in it. If you think of archetypal sacrifice as the sacrifice of Isaac or other sufferings, this is there's a vacuum here that we need to fill in conceptually, psychologically. Second, more specifically about the sociology of this event, maybe you refer to there's a particular context. There's not a group of people mobilizing religious values in a new enterprise of donation from the living. It seems that for many ultra-Orthodox people, there is a religious problem with donation from the dead. This is, for good or for bad, the default practice in the West. It creates a sense of discord. They have been pressed under much public pressure, even laws suggesting in a way or proposals to exclude non-donors from reception. So this donation, this sacrifice is not so much voluntary. It's excessive agency on the individual, but it's a product of a very particular social pressure and construction of duty to each other.
Just quick for Galili, then to Yechiel. First of all, thank you for this very rich comment, and I have to pick some of the points that you made in order to say something about this miserable religion of secular. And I think that when I started with The Happy Prince of Oscar Wilde, I thought maybe I will leave it out, but for me it stands as a paradigm. The way in which in modern society altruism becomes the conduct of the non-humans, and indeed the study of altruism is mostly manifested in sociobiology. I think I'm writing this somewhere in the paper, that it is no coincidence that sociobiology picks on altruism, because the way you describe the very tense dialectics between the theological roots of sacrificing to the sacred order, and now that God is dead, so to speak, and now we have to exercise our social relations on a different register, it creates a social desire for reconceptualizing again and again the way that society ought to be conducted. And it is no wonder that, or when Auguste Comte frames the term altruism, he refers to the ideal, to not yet actualized, to the future stage of society, which is not present. This is just a quick comment to one of your points. And Yechiel, I agree with both points. The sacrifice of living donation is more complex than it seems on its even medical record, because on the one side it says has no risk. It's 0.0 something like of risk of death. There was one incident in Israel of a living donor who died on the operation bed. Furthermore, there is some studies proving that living organ donors conduct a much healthier life than average. So what's the sacrifice here, you ask? And you're making another layer of complexity to the discourse and to the rhetoric, and I agree with that. And I also agree with the second point, that religion has to be understood even more as a sociological factor that has to take into account the political context, the cultural context of the brain death controversy, of what is meant to be and the pressure to become an organ donor, at least donor card holder. And I think that you are right that that the phenomenon or the organization, the Matnat Chaim, needs to be understood also against this background.
Yes, please. Can you pass the mic?
Okay.
And who?
You.
Okay. So, thank you. Very interesting, both in presentation and the comments on it. The part that I want to address is tied to. It seems you had one side of a contrast class associated with Gemeinschaft, but without the work that would do vis-a-vis Gesellschaft when speaking about the social order. So with respect to the secular, sort of these broader projects of the social, where sort of what was required was what was available, the view from nowhere, from everywhere at the same time, sort of absent of robust content. And it seems in those contexts, sacrifice for the social is disaster, right? It's means to the larger machine. So you get this sparse content there, which means where are you going to find that robust content? It's going to be in terms of much thicker narratives. And it's at those places where you get sort of a richer frame for sacrifice. And then, sort of how you unpack it, that's going to be narrative specific. It's going to be tied to, which narrative. And so the question then is, to what degree is it possible to generalize from, say, the account you've given, say, in Israel, the context of Israel, and the kinds of narratives involved, justification for sacrifice, vis-a-vis other contexts where it seems when you move to Gemeinschaft and you have that more robust narrative, kind of the nature, the justification, and what will motivate it, it's going to then shift in appropriate ways. So is this, to what degree, generalizable, and do you need to make this narrative specific? And then you're going to have sort of different interesting variants of this intersection of the secular and religious or some robust tradition.
If I understood you right, I think that I have an answer in the sense that organ donations or organ transfers, let's say, universally, follow kind of the same political economy dynamics, that is the interplay between the state, the market, the family, against the background of shortage, and with the flourishing of agencies such as Matnat Chaim, which can be found as parallels in other places, not specifically religious, but private initiatives, NGOs, and other agencies of matching living donors with patients outside the premises of the state. So I guess that in the world of organ transplant, this could be a very interesting case of the Israeli case, or in general of a country, of a society which has any means, any technological, any medical means of promoting organ donations, yet its organ donor rates are very poor, and this is one layer. And the second layer is the sociological organization of how this can be explained in sociological factors. So I guess this could be different and varies according to societies and according to political and cultural setting. But I think that there are some universals in the sense of, in the resemblance between organ donation and religion, and in the theological or logical roots of the sacrificed body and so on and so forth. So,
very short remark, because the question was very interesting, and Hagai's paper is not mine, right? But I find it very interesting the way you elaborate what we call the social, or even the political project of modernity. And then perhaps the context that perhaps is missing here is the association between the organ donation and the war machines of modernity, right? Since the French Revolution, the Napoleon era, First and Second World War, to contemporary Israel. And where the discourse, false or right, on sacrificing is being time and again used and misused. And during this time, if you look on certain halachic discourses in Jewish tradition, in different frames, you will see a resistance to sacrifice. In terms, it is a false sacrifice for the state, for history, such. And therefore, the so-called, the sacred discourse withdraw from that, right? And create actually a moment of resistance. And even, if you continue that, going back to Yechiel's remark on Isaac, on even on Jesus, and act of, there are more, I will argue, secular commentaries on sacrifice. Because if you look at Talmud or Tafsir or different, church interpretations, there you find, degree of freedom, including critique and different way of transforming, right, the act of sacrificing into mimetic degrees, right, of telling about that, and so on. So I like in that matter to add, right, this moment of resistance, and this is why I would try, to argue to be dialectic enough in order to be in play with paradoxical one with both traditions. Right?
Yeah, and so.
Thank you. Thanks, Hagai. I really enjoyed reading the paper. The first presentation today problematized the distinction between body and mind, and in many ways the institutionalization of organ donation problematizes the boundary between the individual and the collective in a kind of obvious way. But I'm trying to think about the psychosocial dynamics of pain and how it's transformed when it's mediated through the institution. So in thinking about classical kinship and anthropology, Marshall Sahlins last year basically reviewed it all and said, if we think about it, kinship is essentially living each other's lives at the bottom line when we look at it cross-culturally. And so giving an organ should ultimately create a very strong kind of kinship tie, but when it's mediated through this donation institution, that network or that connection is precluded. So my question is, in what sense does your work speak to kinship theory and challenge it or forward it, and how biological technologies relate to kinship? And also, where is the potential collective pain? Like, if somebody gives an organ, it's not just individual pain. The psychosocial dynamics of pain would obviously presumably be shared with close kin and family and acquaintances. So in what sense then does this donation institution mediate this collective pain? and what kind of metaphysical communities does it generate? I think I'm hearing we're talking about national community, ethno-religious community. So it might be interesting to think about the way in which the institution becomes a reservoir for some kind of collective suffering, and what kind of constitutive social work that does.
I suggest maybe that we collect, because the microphone here is half, and I would like to also.
Hagai, thank you very much for the paper. I'm wondering why you seem to sort of conflate the sacrifice and the gift. It seems like you could have gone in a different direction and said there's two very different discourses here. There's the discourse of the sacrifice and the discourse of the gift. The discourse of the sacrifice, it might be seen as this in the Niebuhrian sense of the ultimate basis of ethics is the sacrifice, the complete giving of the self till death in Christian ethics, and that. Even though in America and many other places it's called the gift of life, really the underlying discourse is one of sacrifice. The living donation discourse in Israel consciously also takes this name, the gift of life, but it seems almost to be rejecting the idea of sacrifice. And in doing so, maybe it's embracing the idea of the gift, whereas the sacrifice in Christian ethics is universal in order to save the entire world. The gift ethic is communal. It is always focused on a continual sustenance of community. And so maybe there's just two different kinds of ethics going on here.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Hagai. I have a question, which is a practical one. How is the altruistic living donation in the States? Is it also related to this community-oriented ethos? This was my first question, and the second question is how would such a Jewish religious perspective as the one that you highlighted react to, for example, something like selling your organs to give the money to the community? How does that differ? Does that differ? Because I'm interested because, of course, on the Christian perspective, selling would always be just because it's an act of a money transaction would. So does the community justify that act? Would the community justify that act?
It's a point that Moshe Halbertal makes in his book on sacrifice, which I think is a good point. And what he says is basically that the transition from giving to giving up has to do with the fear that the gift that is given is ultimately a self-serving gift. Because it's part of, it can become a transaction accompanied by an expectation to receive something from God in return. And in order to avoid that fear of the gift becoming part of a transaction, there is a shift into giving up. And presumably, the more you give up, the more you love the one that you give up, what it is that you give up for. And it's tempting to see the transition as a mistake, some kind of mistake that brings in a conceptual mistake in the concept of sacrifice, and that ultimately shows itself in the logic that says that if you don't give up everything, then your love is meaningless, it's worthless.
Okay, so if it's here, I will answer. Okay, so Ian, about kinship. First of all, the idea of living donations stemmed out from the fact that genetic proximity promised a good chance of successful transplant. But nowadays, today with advances in medical technologies, it is possible to even enlarge the pool of organ donors beyond the genetic pools of proximity, and to receive organs from people who only share your blood type, and now even that can be extended even further. And that bears significant anthropological meaning in terms that relatedness is now more an anthropological understanding of kinship rather than biological or medical. And sure, this has many methodological and theoretical implications in the social study of organ donations and the social reality. Sure, that's a way that need to be followed in this research. Ari, about your comment, thank you. I need to think it over and and maybe we'll talk later to see how specifically how to embed it into this analysis. Marta, living donation in Israel in the state level are different in both the ethical level and in the procedural level. First of all, you need to go to undergo a committee that approves and qualifies the donor. Actually, also all organ donations in Israel have to be authorized by the state agency in order that the transplant will be taking place in Israel. If you are coming with a donor, with a living donor, you need to prove that there is no materialistic considerations are involved in any way, and that the donor is medically eligible for donation. And there is a tension that I'd rather not go into it right now between the transplant center operated by the Ministry of Health and this private organization, on the basis that actually I mentioned in my talk, they have a different standing, and they are not obliged to the ethical code that the Ministry of Health is needs to comply with. And the second question about religious standing for people who donate or sell their kidney in order to provide money for the community. Actually, this is not usual. There is a ban, and the prohibition is very clear against any form of organ trafficking and organ selling. And I don't know any particular case of someone who wishes to sell his organs and take them and give the money to a community.
Is it prohibited halachically or legally?
First legally, and I know that there are declarations of rabbis saying that this is immoral. Hami, this is the gift relations and the sacrifices, the tension between these two, let's say, moral economies of the self versus God or versus the other is very interesting, and there is rich anthropological literature which I'm familiar about the economy of the gift and the self-rewarding gift and the expectation of reward. And of course, this is also embedded in the sense of the gift of life. What could be rewarded when once giving you your own life? But yes, I will take a look into Moshe Halbertal's book and see how it helps me.
All right, so let's collect a few more questions. We have 5 minutes to end, so you'll have the prerogative of not answering the question. Yes, please, in the back.
Following Ari's comment, I think it's commendable that you were brave enough to make that paradigmatic leap from the discourse of altruism with its universalistic preconceptions to the communal one with its exceptional preconceptions. And I always go for intellectual comfort to the forefathers' teachings, so I take Durkheim this time. And I think Durkheim supports you in that, because he equates what Galili called the order of the divine with the order of the social. And if this is the case, here you have the link between the religious practice and ethos and the social in its communal sense. And this is quite, it's not politically correct. This is why it's so commendable.
Oh, it's okay. He addressed it at the end.
Can you pass down the mic? Thank you.
So, Hagai, you've been offered a few models to think about this donation. So you started with the sacrifice and the martyr. Michael offered that this is in fact in some ways a debt, or conceived to be a debt, or Ari said a gift rather than a sacrifice. I want to offer another model. In a way, this is a case in which these people in their own conception, especially those coming from the settlements, are people who already made the sacrifice before the donation. They are already martyrs. They're living out there in what they seem to think as a great sacrifice to the nation. But this is a sacrifice that is not recognized by great parts of the nation. So these are, in some ways, unfortunate martyrs. And it reminds me of Kierkegaard's discussion of Abraham, that the real challenge is after he walks down from the mountain, not the sacrifice of Isaac, but how do you continue to live when you're not recognized as a martyr? And I think that this is it's not a miserable religion, it's a miserable martyr who wants to be recognized as a martyr. And the excessiveness of the acts are actually an attempt to gain recognition for the sacrifice that has already been made, but was not recognized. Now, I know that this is not the most generous reading of what otherwise would seem as a noble deed, and so I qualify. But I do think that it's important that it's coming from these specific people who do see themselves as big. Also the ultra-Orthodox in some ways. They're killing themselves in studying Torah. And they're not getting the nation's recognition for that sacrifice.
So when you answer, just give us the details. The data are religious Zionists contributing more, donating more than the
Okay, so
may I say something short?
there was Shane also. Before we
if it follows, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. No, if it follows. I just, speaking from Canada, your questions about, is this racist or not? In Canada with the universal healthcare system, I think many Canadians would think indeed that such a practice would be racist, but it would be moot because the Canada Health Act just makes such private healthcare illegal based on the socialized system that's in Canada. So it's kind of besides the point. It just would not be allowed to occur. You get prosecuted. But I was, based on your talk, because I'm a doctor, efficacy really kind of appeals to me, and the most eye-popping part of your paper was numbers. So it's working. That's the thing that I see. I see something really popping out at me saying this is effective. And I'm wondering. So my question is based on quantification. And in Canada there is, and I'm sure in Israel as well, there's no serial donation, right? It's a one-time instance for the living. But the practice of blood donation actually does have numbers attached to it based on how many times one donates, which is a maximum, I think, of once a month or something. You can eventually get the equivalent of a platinum card based on a series of donations over the course of 20, 30 years. You increasingly get recognition for your altruistic acts, which becomes kind of competitive. And based on the numbers that I see, and the kind of almost exponential, not quite, but the rapid rise in number of donations which is occurring in this private institution, I'm wondering if there's a implication for that rise that could be explained more than simply just success begets success. Is there a sinister implication based on the religious framework that's there? Is there an element? Could there eventually become an element of coercion for it? I'm just reflecting. Where do numbers? Where does the success, the quantification, play in the practice?
I have just a quick question, which I think also has to do with the embeddedness of this practice in sort of larger context. Since you start your paper by talking about how religion, Orthodox religion, mainly plays this prohibitive role vis-a-vis post-mortem donation, I'm interested in whether this organization, which focuses on living donation, has any kind of an explicit or implicit position vis-a-vis that. For example, you could see how this living donation could be viewed as a substitute for the need for post-mortem donation, and therefore some of the good that it's doing in a way is offset by the way in which it kind of supports or fails to question a larger prohibitive role by religion. Or you could see these individuals trying to push back against the kind of ultra-Orthodox concerns about time of death and prohibitions, and saying, religion in general needs to play a more facilitative role rather than a blocking role to facilitate not only living but post-mortem donation. So I don't know if they've said anything about this, but that would be interesting to know.
Okay. I think I wanted also to
refer to the points made here. I mean, there's discussion in Halakha, Jewish law, in late Middle Ages. There's the supreme value of redemption of the captives. And the Halakha says you would sell a scroll of Torah for this sake, but not a synagogue. And the explanation given is this is the way of the world, this is not the way of the world. So it's not exactly the divine order. The Halakha doesn't say one is more sacred or protected than the other. There is another social order here to be explored about boundaries. And this organ donation group really transgresses it in a way, creates a new realm. But if we reflect on these historical archetypal sacrifices, that it made sense for Abraham to go and sacrifice Isaac and not to be sent on a suicide sacrifice. And then for Jesus to submit himself to death and not to go and sacrifice Mary. So it's not just that we're willing to give everything for God. There's another set of boundaries in our social cultural orders that is not clearly a divine order, but belong to a certain kind of other order, and also plays a role why people don't donate a kidney even though it's nothing.
Yes, okay. Thank you. There were some few interpretive comments that I have to think about it and see if it all fits into the data and to the story of Matnat Chaim. And there were some specific questions that I will shortly answer regarding the organization's point of view concerning brain death. Actually, it is interesting to see how it is not on the table. And again, this is another indicator of playing now the card of we are private. We do not have to answer big ethical questions about organ donations. We are making our milut chassadeh. Charity. We are doing our little charity thing here, and not dealing with these big controversial questions. I'm taking totally the Durkheim approach that Chaim suggested. And I forgot the numbers.
Where does quantification fit in creative altruism?
Yes. Well, no. Nothing could be. Altruism is hard to quantify and say, okay, this is another instant of altruistic behavior. You could never know in living donations what are the interior motives, the social dynamics, you can guess and interpret it on basis of some, from the sociological point of view, from gender relations, from different class maybe statuses, but it is a big and ethical question in transplantation: is the donation really altruistic or not? So this concludes, and now I will have the other hat of the of the conference organizer, and inviting you all to lunch here down. Yes, it's 12. Yes. Okay. Down here at the cafeteria, Shai will lead the way.
Absolutely. Follow me.
And later,
Valuables.